Good morning, Wabash. This morning we're going to see a talk by Professor Jeff Drury. He arrived at Wabash College in 2012 from Central Michigan University, where he had been teaching in communication for 4 years. He earned his PhD in political rhetoric at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, go Badgers, and the BA and MA from Northern Illinois University. Professor Drury enjoys Big Ten sports and spending quality time with his wife, rhetoric faculty member Sarah Drury. Here to give his talk titled The Privilege of Privilege, Jeff Drury.
Good morning, Wabash. Good morning. That's nice. I like that. Thanks to the Sphinx Club and especially Nathan Bodie for inviting me to give this talk. I'm honored to participate in a tradition that actually values the power of oratory in our community. And I imagine that there are high expectations for me, given that I'm a rhetoric professor here. So I'll try to do my best. It may comfort you to know that actually I'm quite nervous, and so even we who teach the craft still feel the nerves of public speaking. I'm partially nervous, though, because of the sensitive nature of my talk today. I want to talk about social privilege, and more specifically, the privilege of privilege. We've seen social privilege talked about a lot in the United States recently, especially among youth. College students are given a common warning to check your privilege, and this spawned a viral article in the Princeton Tory this past spring. We have situations like those in Ferguson, Missouri, where we talk about things like white privilege and race relations. And just last weekend, Christian privilege was on display when the Kansas City Chief Safety, Hussein Abdullah, received an excessive celebration penalty for praying in a non-privileged format. I suppose he should have done the Tebow instead. Now at Wabash, we see this conversation at well. In the classroom, EQ discussions seem to always go to the concept of privilege, especially when talking about the choices available to Westmore and the other Westmore. And more recently, some of you have been yakking about the idea of privilege and the responsible use of social media. So these topics are, I think, ongoing, and I want to add to the conversation, but I hope to provide a different vantage point, one that seeks to reclaim the value and the potential of privilege. Like most chapel talks, mine is motivated by a deep sense of love and commitment to this place. And like most chapel talks, it will be personal as well as political. First, I'm going to talk a little about the concept of privilege, and then I will turn to the privilege of privilege and what I mean by that. So what is privilege? I initially went to an authoritative source. No, not Wikipedia, but the Oxford English Dictionary. The OED defines privilege as, quote, a right, advantage, or immunity granted to or enjoyed by an individual beyond the usual rights or advantages of others. I know that's kind of a wordy definition, so basically, privilege exists if someone has an advantage over someone else. In common usage today, we talk about privilege in relation to social identity, categories such as race, religion, biological sex, age. All these things are areas where we might encounter privilege or advantages based on those identity traits. As a rhetorical scholar, I see the value of using metaphors, so I thought that I would talk about a metaphor for understanding social privilege. And I think the metaphor of a slot machine is a good one to use. I'm sure you're all familiar with what slot machines look like. Imagine, though, this huge slot machine with a variety of reels, and each reel is spinning, and on that reel are different options for that social identity category. So you have a reel for race, and it's going through all of the combinations and options available, and it lands on your race. And then there's a slot cycling through all the options for biological sex, and it lands on your biological sex, and one for your religion, and one for your age, etc., socioeconomic status, on down the line. Now, just like a real slot machine, the various combinations have different payoffs that come out of them. So my payoff for the combination that I get on my slot machine is different than the payoff that you would get, and I'll return to this in a little bit. Ladies and gentlemen, in the privileged slots, I hit the jackpot. I'm white, cha-ching. I'm male, cha-ching. I live in the United States of America, the greatest country on earth with the best military there is. Cha-ching! I grew up in a suburban middle-class household. I had a nuclear family with parents who never divorced. Cha-ching. I'm in a marriage recognized by my state, cha-ching, and my religion, cha-ching. I have a bachelor, a master's, and a PhD. You guessed it, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. And I'm a professor at the liberal arts college for men. Can I get a cha-ching? So at this point, you're probably saying, why the heck are you talking about privilege? Because you have so much going on. Let me assure you, it was not so that I could look down on all of you and let you bask in my glory. That was not the point here. Rather, it's related to how I spent my summer vacation. I participated this summer at 2 workshops at Hope College up in Michigan. They were led by Brenda Allen and Kate Palchevsky, 2 scholars in the field of communication who challenged me to think differently about my role as a professor, as an advocate, and as an all-around human being. Some of you may also know that I'm team teaching a course with Professor Gelbman this semester on social movements. There's been a lot of talk in that class about changing the world, and so I suppose some of those ideas are influencing my talk here today. But don't worry, this is not a speech designed to spark and mobilize a social movement. I have actually a much more modest aim. I want to use the slot machine metaphor to offer 3 propositions about privilege. And my hope is that as we think about these propositions, we as a community can think about our personal and individual opportunities for change. Proposition 1, the payouts of privilege exist, and these payouts differ from individual to individual. Who here is left-handed? Raise your hand. Own it. All right, look around. Most of you who didn't raise your hand, you can put your hands down. Most of you who didn't raise your hand probably think it's a trivial point for me to raise the idea of being left-handed and to talk about privilege. But those of you who are left-handed likely understand why it's a relevant point of conversation. I encourage you to, those who are right-handed, to speak with the left-handers who raise their hands to think about how the world advantages those who happen to be right-handed. I'm familiar with the plight of left-handers because my mom and my sister are left-handed, and actually my brother has swung both ways for years, and I mean that literally. So in my nuclear family of 5 of us, only my dad and myself really understood what it means to take notes in class, for instance, without smudging the paper, what it means to drive a car in the United States with our dominant hand, the fact that we could use scissors without having to go to a specialty store and buy a special pair because we are left-handed. Now again, this isn't that left-handed people are worse than us. I didn't want them to raise their hand so we can go beat them up out back or anything like that. It's more about the fact that the world advantages those who are right-handed, and those who are left-handed have to deal with it. The same is true of other, perhaps more significant social identity categories. And to demonstrate, I'm going to use a hypothetical situation, but I'm going to build upon that with real research to show how privilege is alive and well in the United States. Let's start with the fact that my name sounds white. Now, that's not the hypothetical part. Do a Google image search for Jeff, and you'll see a lot of white faces looking back at you. That is true. But suppose I'm searching for a job. This is the hypothetical element. Because my name sounds white, I am more likely to get a job interview were I to apply. The Huffington Post recently ran an article, this was last month, about a man named Jose who applied for a bunch of jobs and got no interviews. He dropped 1 letter from his resume, changed nothing else, but removed the S from his name. So Jose became Joe, and the story changed. His experience actually confirms research published in sources such as the American Economic Review that employers have implicit bias against names that signal certain races or ethnicities. So because of my name, I get a job interview. Now, because I am male, I am more likely to get a job offer after that interview. A number of studies, some as recent as last year, suggest that men enjoy privileges over women in this regard. A 2007 study from the American Journal of Sociology is actually quite fascinating because it suggests that actually mothers are the most disadvantaged group when it comes to biological sex. So mothers tend to be viewed as less committed to their work and tend to get lower starting salaries when compared to women who are non-mothers as well as men. Now, what's fascinating about this study, though, is that the same report found that fathers have the opposite. Fathers tend to be viewed as more committed to their jobs. They tend to be viewed as more stable in their work environment and are offered higher starting salaries as a result. And again, this is just on the basis of their fatherhood or motherhood status, all other things being equal. You can check out the study. It's like 45 pages. I'm sure you'll read it in your spare time. But it's a good study to show that this privilege is at play. So I get this hypothetical job. Now, because I am a white male, people aren't going to wonder if it was affirmative action that gave it to me. And because my anatomy matches my gender identity, I'm much less likely to get fired from that job and more likely to get raises. This comes from a 2007 report from the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law, what I believe to be a credible source. Now again, none of this, nothing that I've talked about has anything to do with my qualifications whatsoever, but rather my social identity and the privileges afforded to that identity. And because much of this occurs implicitly as bias rather than explicitly as discrimination, so people don't talk in a room and say, gee, I don't think we want women working here. It's much more implicit than that. We ought to be aware of how these biases and privileges operate. So let's bring it closer to home. Let's talk about a real situation right here at Wabash. Because I am able-bodied, I am not only physically capable of standing here before you today, but I can reach my office on campus. Many of us may not be aware that half of the academic buildings on campus are inaccessible to students with physical disabilities. That is, students who cannot use stairs. I currently have a student enrolled in one of my classes who's been in a boot for the entire semester on his foot. We were able to move our classroom from Fine Arts to Baxter, which was fine, but my office is on the second floor of Fine Arts, so he's unable to just drop in to say hello, to talk about the class, to chat about life. He's getting a different experience at Wabash because of his physical limitations. And we do a disservice to the student body if we say, come to Wabash, you'll have great relationships with your professors, but only if you can physically reach them. If we are serious about retaining and recruiting students who represent all kinds of diversity, then we need to do something about these elements of privilege on our own campus. So Proposition 2, privilege is often unseen and unintentional. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I've already hinted at this, but I want to emphasize that privilege is not the same thing as discrimination. The slot machine metaphor is really powerful here because, as with real slot machines, the payout in the privileged slots is by luck rather than choice. Now, certainly some people do use their privilege to discriminate against others, but privilege itself is not an inherently wicked or evil thing. And because those who benefit from privilege often do so without any fault of their own, we tend to overlook how it's operating in our lives until we ourselves go without privilege. And we know that the situations where we ourselves lack privilege really suck, and we try to avoid them, and we try to do things to fix those. So why not help others avoid that same crappiness that's lacking in their privilege too? So my third and final proposition, embrace the privilege of privilege. The title of my talk, The Privilege of Privilege, is playing on a double meaning of the word here. One meaning revolves around the social benefits that I've been talking about to this point, but the other meaning of privilege refers to an honor or a treat. So later on today, when you're reliving my talk, this is the meaning you'll use when you say, it was a real privilege to hear Dr. Drury's chapel talk. Right? So the privilege of privilege means that we recognize the honor that goes along with accepting the benefits we receive on the basis of our identity, so that we accept them with honor. And let me be clear, I use the word we and our here intentionally because every single person in this room has some element of their social identity that gives you privilege. Again, whether it's living in the United States, whether it's being male, whether it's being employed and being middle class, things like this. If you disagree with me about your privilege, speak with me afterwards, send me an email. I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. So we all have privilege, and while we cannot change the roots of our privilege, short of fundamentally changing our identities or fundamentally changing the world and society around us, and we know that neither of those is really an easy task, although I'm expecting my social movement class guys to do that. We can't really change our privilege, though, but we can be aware of and harness our privilege in ways that make a difference. For example, my privilege has given me this platform as a professor here to speak to all of you about the issues of ability and privilege on campus. So let me offer 2 calls to action. First, become aware of your privilege. Now, I hope my talk has helped with this, but I encourage you to spend a day seriously thinking about how other people might have a harder time doing things than you simply because of their identity. I recently spoke with Sky King and Mark Troiano, 2 of your fellow Wallies, about a social experiment that they're looking to launch later this month. And this conversation happened independent of this chapel talk. They had no idea that I was going to be talking about the idea of privilege, that I even was giving a chapel talk. But their idea, their experiment, what they're calling a new day, is exactly the kind of awareness that I'm talking about when I say be aware of your privilege. On October 25th, they are going to spend 24 hours from midnight to midnight blindfolded. Their goal is to grow within themselves, to appreciate and understand what they have, and to see how resilient they can be when something that they rely on is taken away from them. In the language of my talk, they're trying to understand the privilege that goes along with having sight. Their focus is deeply personal to them, but they believe the message will resonate with you as a community and also the greater humanity. So they actually have a blog site that they're going to be using, or I'm sorry, a Tumblr site that they're going to be using to share their experience leading up to, during, and after the project. It's prjanewday.tumblr.com. I encourage you to check it out. They illustrate how we can step outside of our comfort zones and we can be inspired to live life a little differently, if only for a single day. This effort helps build empathy, and it's something that I encourage you to support and to follow their lead. So for instance, next time you reach for the single ply or double ply toilet paper and want to complain about that, remember that you are privileged to have an arm to reach for it, to have a stall that is your own, and to have indoor plumbing where you can use toilet paper. So these everyday actions of remembering the elements of privilege in our lives will hopefully teach us to lead our lives a little differently. Now, empathy is a good starting point, but it's not enough. After all, the defining statements of our college emphasize action and not empathy. Last week, Greg Estelle talked about the action promoted by Old Wabash, and when we rise in a few minutes to sing the song, you'll promise that forevermore, as in days of yore, their deeds be noble and grand. Again, deeds, not thought. The gentleman's rule focuses on our conduct on and off campus, not our empathy. And the mission statement calls us to live humanely and act responsibly. These aren't platitudes that sound nice on the back of a business card. So don't check your privilege. Don't feel guilty about your privilege. Don't just recognize your privilege. Rather, embrace it, love it, celebrate it, and leverage it. Leverage your privilege for good, keeping in mind, if you'll indulge the adaptation here, that with great privilege comes great responsibility. I heard someone echoing it. Thank you very much. Now, this isn't an appeal for general humane living. We all know that the Wabash Day projects coming up this weekend are a good way to live out that pillar in our society through volunteerism and things of that nature. My call to action actually requires less time, but more courage. I ask you to use your privilege to become an ally through involvement and speaking out for those who have less voice than you. Now, some of you, especially those from a Christian background, may initially think of the golden rule here, the idea to do unto others as you would have them do to yourself. But the golden rule implies equality among everyone, that your wants and needs are the same as others. So then you might say, well, what about the silver rule, which says, do not do to others what you would not have them do unto you, this idea of doing no harm, or turn the other cheek. Now, this is perhaps a better starting point, but again, there's a lack of action here. There's not a proactive element to this. The privilege of privilege, on the other hand, recognizes that each of us is different, but is no less human, and we act upon that principle. As I worked on this talk, I actually thought about bringing in a lot of examples of what this spirit looks like, of people in this community, and there are dozens of them who do this every day. In an earlier version, I even started naming some of them and recognizing them for their work. But then I thought that doing so would actually cheapen the privilege of privilege, because it would suggest that it's about a grand gesture or about recognition rather than about doing the small everyday acts that improve the community. So let me talk more abstractly about what I mean when I say embrace the privilege of privilege. I mean refrain from saying the funny thing at the expense of other cultures. I mean stand up for someone who is struggling to fit in simply because he is different. Reach out to that person. Sit with them at the Spark Center or in your fraternity. I mean to speak for those who don't have the resources to do so themselves. These are the students who use their privilege, for instance, to criticize and to challenge those who make fun of their fellow Wallies because they can't afford new clothes, because they don't speak English as a first language, or because they love people of the same sex. And challenge here not in the sense of ridiculing them, but rather asking them to rethink their own ideas and to live more humanely. These are the faculty, staff, and administrators who avoid implicit bias when serving on hiring committees and who use their authority to change norms and structures that prioritize one group's privilege over another. Now, Lord knows I'm not a good example of this in all times. I do not always have this courageous advocacy. For me, it's an ongoing process, and I constantly have to remind myself to be more inclusive because I do have a lot of privilege. It's much easier to sit in that cozy bubble and to think about my own experience. In fact, when I moved my class from fine arts to Baxter, I'm ashamed to admit that my first reaction was frustration. I was annoyed that I had to have class in a building that was further away from my office. And we all know that fine arts is so far from everything else on campus, so far that it often requires the use of a car, and you know who you are who do that. But then I realized that here I'm being selfish, right? I thought about how the student who's in a boot might have to have this conversation 4 or 5 times with each of his professors. I thought about how he's marked from the first day as someone who needs special treatment. He's different, if only until the boot comes off. And of course, we know that for some people, metaphorically speaking, the boot never comes off. It follows them every day of their life. And so then I thought about the persuasion research, which is what I study, that people are more effective advocates if they argue for things that go against their own self-interest or that aren't in line with their own goals. I realized that a message for change, a message to recognize privilege, would actually be more and not less powerful coming from me, someone who has no self-interest in whether or not we have elevators, and in fact may be financially harmed if the college is putting money into building elevators in the Fine Arts Center. So thinking about how we can use our privilege to talk about the needs and the values and the humanity of others. One of my personal heroes is Robert F. Kennedy. For me, he's a model of this kind of audacity. He was privileged, and he was probably privileged more than anyone in this room. He could have easily ignored his fellow humans, but he chose not to. He had the courage and the compassion to fight injustice and to ally with those who were less fortunate than himself. If you haven't read Thurston Clark's book called The Last Campaign about Kennedy's presidential bid, I highly recommend it. In the book, Clark talks about how Kennedy was actually a big advocate for Native American youth. In politics, he used his Senate seat to advocate for policies. In speeches, he talked about poverty and high suicide rates among Native American youth. And in his campaign, he visited dozens of reservations. And this was all to the dismay of his campaign advisors who said, "You're wasting your time. Native Americans aren't a substantial part of the electorate." Now, sure, Kennedy cared about votes. And he didn't dedicate his life to Native American advocacy. But for him, on this topic, the morally courageous act superseded the politically advantageous one. This explains why, on April 16, 1968, he spent a few minutes with the Democratic delegates in South Dakota and then spent 12 hours at the Pine Ridge Reservation, a place Clark describes as, quote, the ground zero of human suffering on the North American continent. It's also a place that no presidential candidate has visited since. Now, as a professor of rhetoric, I could not go an entire speech without quoting another speech, so I thought that I would share a statement from Robert F. Kennedy This was delivered shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and I think it eloquently defines the spirit and the attitude that I'm talking about today. He asked his fellow Americans to remember, and I'm quoting now, that those who live with us are our brothers and sisters, that they share with us the same short movement of life, that they seek, as we do, nothing but the chance to live out their lives in purpose and happiness, winning with satisfaction and fulfillment they can. As I conclude, let me remark that the privilege of privilege does not demand you abandon everything else to selflessly serve others, although there is certainly honor in doing that. It does ask, though, that we think critically about our own sources of privilege, that we respect our own humanity and the humanity of others, and that we lead when others lack the courage or the privilege to do so. It asks that we live each day recognizing the small things that make life worthwhile and that the things that make us proud to be Wallies. We are given a gift to be here, the privilege of living in this country, of getting an education at this institution or being employed by this college. These are things that many in the world will never get to experience. So use your privilege to fight the good fight, not to make yourself feel better, but to make a difference. In doing so, we will fulfill our college's mission, and we will become worthy of the tradition that we inherit. Thank you.
All right. This weekend at Wabash, we have Wabash Day, so make sure to get out there and volunteer. This Saturday, football is away at Ohio Westland, and soccer is away at Allegheny. If you would like to stay after to redeem your W, make sure to stay after chapel and see a Sphinx Club member. And before we rise and sing Old Wabash, we have a short announcement from Corey Yoga.
Hi, Wabash. So I know a couple of you guys have seen a camera throughout campus trying to catch guys dance and whatnot, do silly stuff. So a couple of us are putting together a video. We were challenged by IEPY for this little thing called the hashtag College Shakeoff, and it's to raise awareness for any kind of little group or something you want to raise awareness for, and we chose men's mental health. And so we were going to ask that if guys want to, you don't have to, but if you guys get up for like 10 seconds, do something silly, and it'll be part of the video. I just think it'd be cool to get everybody at Wabash involved with this, and it'll be a cool thing that we can challenge other campuses around and do something crazy. So stand up. You have it? Pull it up real quick. Am I in the shot or am I good? All right. You have it? Hold on. I'll get it. 1 second. Do you have it? I can get it. You got it ready? Yeah, that's fine. Are we all ready? Oh, shoot. Hold on. I'm trying. You got 10 seconds. 7, 6, 5, 4. Oh, here you go. And begin. Good. All right, thank you, Wabash.
Thank you, Wabash. All right, now please rise again and sing Old Wabash.